Seeing so many students in the audience always provokes the teacher gene. So I'm going to begin with a question. Who do you think is the world's biggest importer of wheat? I'm not doing it as a test for you. It's a measure of your media. One of the most important processes is unfolding in Africa. How much of the discussion have you seen around the African uprisings that tells you that one of the big drivers of those uprisings is food prices? The biggest importer of wheat in the world is Egypt. 20 million tons in the last 20 months, or 2 years. 20 million tons. So when food prices soar, people pay an incredible price. In Egypt, the average Egyptian citizen spends far more as a share of his or her income on food than people in comparable countries. For instance, in Brazil, if you were in Brazil, you would spend 17% of your monthly income on average, national average, on purchasing food. If you live in Egypt, you will spend much more than twice that. 40% of your income goes on food. How important do you think has been the emphasis of the media on food prices as a major problem in these countries? Did you get that impression from your media? You can't. I don't blame you. But it is, now don't you think it adds some perspective to what's going on? To know that that country is the biggest importer of wheat, that food prices have gone up 30, 40, 50% over a couple of years. Also, one of the last things Mubarak did in desperation, 6 weeks before he was ejected, was to reintroduce price controls, which he had removed under the orders of the structural adjustment program put on him by the World Bank and the IMF with renewed vigor in 2004. Okay? So there you are. Food prices were and are a major... Have we forgotten already that in 2008, because I think the meltdown wiped out everybody's memories, 2008 was a year of food riots across the world. Remember? They were the highest. For the first time, you saw the Western middle classes worrying about food prices in April to June 2008. Or have we forgotten that? There were food riots in Kenya. There were food riots in Somalia. I think at least some of you might remember the food riots in Haiti. 2008, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations tells us, was the record highest price rise on the FAO's food price index. But you know something? It got obliterated. In 2010, it was even higher. Midway through 2010, the food price index registered a 32% increase in a matter of months. And that was much higher. 2008 produced food riots. 2010 produced regime change. Okay. It's not that these were the only factors. Not at all. There were many political factors, compelling internal factors, but they needed a spark. They needed something. Don't write off what food prices and the role of food is, and I'll explain why. Now, incidentally, another country, how many of you can name the African country that was completely self-sufficient in cereals in the 1970s and becomes one of the most major importers of food in the world? Yemen. 1970s, completely self-sufficient in cereals. 2010, one of the world's biggest importers of food. I could name 20 countries like this, and you'd find half of them in that situation that you're seeing now in Africa. So it's that, democracy is very important. The politics of it is very important, but there was a major driver called hunger, food prices. If you look at the streets, if you look at the Arab street, you'll see people out on the street who never ever stepped out in demonstrations and protests. Very conservative sections who never participated in protests and demos. They were there on the street. They still are on the street because the problem is not solved. Okay. We'll come back to the food issue because I think this is titled as Wages of Inequality, Food Crisis, Farm Crisis, and the Media. We're already into two of those. The media told you nothing about this. From what you're telling me, you did not glean from the media coverage that food prices were a major factor in what's going on in Africa, right? You know, every year, the United Nations Development Program, and in fact, the UN has been doing this even before the UNDP became active. It's been, for 30 years, the United Nations has been presenting us every year with a menu, a bill of fare. We don't see it as a consolidated menu, but we do see it in little bits and blobs, don't we? Haven't you read somewhere, you vaguely remember, the Secretary General of the United Nations said that if we spent $15 billion a year additional expenditure on hunger, we could eliminate hunger. Have you read those sort of little items all over the newspapers? Yeah, this you have. Now what I do is, these different little items that appear, I add them up as a menu and try figuring out what they come to. Hunger, $15 billion a year, the Secretary General tells us, will eliminate the extremes of hunger. $10 billion additional expenditure a year, and everyone on the planet has got sanitation. $15 billion a year, and every child, we're talking about additional expenditures, okay? $15 billion additional expenditure a year, and every child on the planet will be in school. $12 billion additional expenditure a year or something like that, and everyone's got access to basic like water. Okay? You put these together and it comes to something like between $60 billion and $80 billion. Right? So what is the UN telling you? It's telling you that $60 to $80 billion additional expenditure, you can solve the most pressing problems of the human race. It's never happened in all those 30 years. Why? What did the government say? No money. There's no money. We can't solve this problem. Where's the money? You put up the money, but we can't do it. You know, let charitable foundations and the UN and philanthropy, let Gates and Buffett do it and all that stuff. But we can't do it because we don't have money. So for 30 years, this amount of $60 to $80 billion governments could not find. Then, 2008 September, Wall Street hits the fan. And the guys and the governments who couldn't find $60 to $80 billion for 30 years find $1 trillion inside of a week. Along with their friends in Europe, they find $3 trillion in the next 3 or 4 months, and God knows how much more since then. And what do they find it for? They find it to give it to the very guys who tanked the world economy. Who wrote your bailout plan? Goldman Sachs. Okay? You collect trillions of dollars, public dollars, to give it to the very guys who tanked the world economy, and you have the money. All these years you didn't have 8% of that money to solve the basic problems of the human race, but you have 12 times that money to hand over to the banks and the trusts and the corporations that completely destroyed the global economy. Incidentally, a little piece of statistical trivia, if you will. In 2008, the year they blew the global economy, American CEOs took home $18 billion in bonuses for that fiscal. For the fiscal in which they blew the global economy, I suppose that was very modest because the previous year it was $34 billion. But they still took home $18 billion in reward. And remember where those dollars came from. It came from a public dollar bailout. It came from public tax dollars which bailed them out. Giant corporations, having brought the world economy to its knees in a drama scripted for the last 2 or 3 decades by neoliberal economists and corporations, have benefited massively from the ruins and the wreckage. As I said, you destroy the world economy, you take home $18 billion in bonuses. But remember this, in the world we live in, and the economics we follow, and the moral philosophy of that economics, every misery is an opportunity. Every misery is an opportunity. Let me quote for you the sage of Omaha, Warren Buffett, whose reaction to the tsunami and the nuclear meltdown in Japan is that it provides a unique buying opportunity of Japanese stocks. This is Reuters. This is Reuters quoting Warren Buffett. Here he is. Immediately after after Japan's nightmare tragedy, he says, if I owned Japanese stocks, I would certainly not be selling them. Frequently something like this, something out of the blue like this, an extraordinary event, creates a buying opportunity, and he advised his friends to invest because the Japanese companies are, on their knees, the stock prices are down, this is the time to buy. Actually, he's right. I don't know, I think 6 years ago, Bob, when I spoke here, soon after the tsunami, I pointed out, I don't know if any of you were present at that talk, you look too young to have been around then. Immediately after the tsunami, it struck me then, and ever since then, in every natural calamity, I, a non-financial journalist, follow the stock markets whenever something terrible happens, because they start doing very well after a week. Buffett was right. 1 week after the tsunami, as the damage was really unfolding, we knew, for instance, that Indonesia had lost nearly 250,000 people. 11 countries were devastated by the tsunami. 11. Out of those 11 countries, 5 have significant stock exchanges. India, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Thailand, and Malaysia. Yeah, Malaysia, Thailand, Sri Lanka, India, and Indonesia. Now what happens? 1 week, everything is devastated and at a standstill. Then, these very stock exchanges register the highest gains of stock exchanges anywhere. Why? The smell of reconstruction dollars. The smell of the money that comes out of that misery. When Warren Buffett is saying invest in Japanese stocks, he knows what he's talking about. He's talking about that rapid pace of reconstruction that's going to take place means billions of dollars in contracts. So if you are smart, you're going to put money where the Japanese stocks are, because the reconstruction will begin. And we all know that the Japanese are pretty good at it. They're very efficient people. When the reconstruction starts, it will be massive. So he says, buy those shares now. In 2004, December 26th, the tsunami hit those 11 countries. Those 5 countries were devastated. And you know what happened after the devastation? From the first week after the devastation, the Sensex, which had never broken out of the 4,000 bracket, the sensitive index of the Bombay Stock Exchange, which had never broken out of the 4,000 bracket, crossed 6,000 and never looked back. It's today scaling around 20,000. It never looked back. That was the breach point. The composite share index of the Colombo Stock Exchange, of the CSE, reached to within 16 points of the highest, which was in the year of its founding. Indonesia, the worst affected nation, 250,000 people dead, the stock exchange is rocked by the earthquake and the tsunami.